to Into the Truth, the podcast where we shine the light of truth on the issues of today. I'm your host, Pier Paolo Finaldi, CEO of the Catholic Truth Society, and today I'm joined by Sally Reid. Welcome, Sally.
Thanks for having me.
So Sally is an award-winning poet whose first collection since her conversion from atheism to Catholicism, Dawn of This Hunger, was the fruit of her 10-year tenure as poet in residence at the Hermitage of the Three Holy Hierarchs. That's quite a difficult one to say there. But Sally, welcome, and we're going to be speaking about poetry in the kind of greater Catholic context, but I can't help but be, my interest is piqued by your story. So tell us, how did you make this move from atheism to Catholicism, and where did kind of poetry feature in that?
Well, it's both a long story and a short story, really. I think that the move happened through my whole life, but actually speaking, it all happened in 2010. So I was living just outside Rome. I was already a poet. And in the March of 2010, I was an atheist and really hated the Catholic Church. And in the December, I was received into the Catholic Church in the Vatican. So it couldn't have been more dramatic, really. And I trained as a psychiatric nurse originally in London, and was brought up to be a fervent atheist and to reject all religion. And I think I wanted to be religious in a sense, but I just felt I couldn't find any grounds for believing, you know. And I always loved poetry, and I think that in my 20s, my poetry, the writing of it, and also what I was reading, it was that was my religion. That was kind of my idol, because if things were difficult on the hospital wards or in my personal life, then the way that I made sense of things was through poetry. So, you know, W.B. Yeats and Sylvia Plath and John Keats. And I was often fond of saying that poetry redeems us without really knowing what that meant. I felt that, you know, poetry gave form to things, gave form to chaos, and made sense of things and kind of saved us. So I was almost fanatical, really, in my poetry. And at the end of my 20s, I quit nursing for many reasons, and cut a long story short, ended up getting married to an Italian and going to live in near Rome. And I was about to start writing a non-fiction book. And the reason I was doing that was because poetry had become to me very... I was beginning to be quite disillusioned with it. I think that contemporary poetry can be very flat-footed and pedestrian. And I felt, as a poetry writer, I was being constrained by the way that poetry was supposed to be in the late 20th century. So, you know, we weren't allowed to talk about transcendence or the soul or anything beyond the absolutely concrete everyday. And so poems about toothbrushes and baseball bats were really, really common, and you couldn't get anything beyond that. You know, Wallace Stevens, etc., seemed an incredibly rare phenomenon. So I was very frustrated with my own poetry as much as anybody else's. So I was going to write a nonfiction book, and that was how I got in touch with a Catholic priest to talk about this nonfiction book, because it was about women's sexuality. So I wanted to talk to him about abortion and contraception and the whys and the wherefores. And once we got talking, I started to think, well, you know, he's really nice and he's actually really intelligent. So how on earth can he be a Catholic priest? And so we started to argue, and then I had 3 sort of major encounters with God, which I can tell you about if we've got the time.
Yeah, please do. Yeah, we're all about encounters with God.
Okay. Yeah. Quick drink. Well, I mean, the first one was in the March of 2010, and it's different. They're all difficult to describe. They're recounted in my book Night's Bright Darkness. A quick plug for that book, which tells the story kind of very well. But the first one was I was having these discussions with this priest, and then one evening I was sitting on my bed and I was rereading a book called I Capture the Castle. And I Capture the Castle is a wonderful, wonderful book. And in it, there's this protagonist who is an atheist, and she wants to be a writer. And she goes to speak to a vicar. And the vicar says to Cassandra, and I had read these lines so many times in my life, and I just skated over them. But this particular night, I read what the vicar said to Cassandra about religion. And he said, religion is an art, and it attempts the communion that all the other arts attempt. And when I read those lines and the others that followed, I suddenly realized it was an enormous epiphany about how my own poetry was really trying to reach God. and that the poem itself, the perfect poem, had already been written by God, and that's creation. And I was simply trying to touch his creation with my creation, which of course is very Dante-esque. I mean, Dante talked about the poetry being God's grandchild, so it's about our relationship with the creator as creators. Now, that all sounds very academic, but that wasn't what I thought that night. All I thought was just this kind of enormous, wow, maybe I'm wrong. That's all really I thought. And when I thought that, all these other thoughts came in about, well, if I am wrong, it means I'm created. And if I'm created, I'm absolutely known. And if I'm absolutely known, then I'm absolutely loved. And that sort of flooded into me. And then I was very much, hang on a minute, this is really scary, and I need to find out what this means. So I got in touch with the priest, and I said, well, maybe I'm not an atheist after all. And he just said, okay, well, I'm not going to try and convert you. He always said the only person that can convert you is Jesus Christ. So I kind of carried on, and a couple of weeks later, by this time I'd stopped writing. I'd stopped writing the nonfiction book and poetry, and I was kind of very churned up and not really understanding what my life was about anymore, feeling very lonely. And one night I wasn't sleeping, and insomnia was a big feature of my conversion. And I was downstairs reading T.S. Eliot, Animula, if anybody's interested. And then I went back up to bed, and I lay down. I actually lay on the floor because my daughter wasn't well, so I was lying down on the floor next to her. And I had a very, very strange experience, which is very difficult for me to understand or to describe at the time. But what happened was I lay down, and tears just started to pour down my face. And I felt as though my whole being was kind of coming straight. It was like I'd been kind of twisted and arguing and looking over my shoulder all my life. And suddenly I felt absolutely kind of cleansed and relieved, and was just crying. And I was neither happy nor sad. It was the strangest feeling. And it lasted for some time. It was like I'd been injected with a drug. And so the next day I wrote to the priest, and I tried to explain what had happened. And he just wrote back and said, next week is Pentecost, which meant nothing to me at all. And then the final experience was about a week after that. And I was equally kind of, by this time I wasn't happy. I realized that there was definitely something going on. I realized that there had to be a God, but it was a faceless God. I didn't know which God it was because I did not want to be a Christian at all. To me, Christians were just like the pits of the...
Was that because the kind of cultural Christianity of England hadn't really spoken to you at all, or you just hadn't encountered it? Really?
I was brought up to think that Christians were particularly dense and feeble-minded, really, which I think is like very groundless. Like, I don't know where my father got that from, but still, I mean, he had no respect for the church, and I believed what he said. So I was picking up my daughter from nursery school, and I was early, so I went to this little church near her school, which was a little Carmelite church by the sea, and I went inside and sat down, and again was just churned up, and I was crying again because I didn't know what my life meant anymore, and I looked up at this image of Christ in stained glass, and I said out loud, "If you're there, you have to help me." And as I said those words...
Classic prayer, that one. Like.
Yeah, and as I said it, this presence just kind of seemed to come down and just almost physically lift me, and my tears just dried, and I felt as though I'd had amnesia and somebody walked into the room that gave my whole self back to me. It was the most incredible feeling, the most dramatic of the three encounters. And as I left the church that day, I knew that I was a Christian, and I was only interested in getting back to that presence, and of course the only way to do that is the Eucharist. So that's how I became Catholic.
Amazing. Oh, what a wonderful story. So I was interested when you were speaking about the fact that you thought poetry kind of redeems, which is a kind of, I mean, I'm more of a musician rather than a poet, so it reminds me of the kind of high romanticism of Beethoven and these who saw in music this kind of redemptive art form. But and presumably for you as well, that you saw that at a certain point that was kind of closed in a sense. It didn't kind of lead on to the next, the true redemption. And at that point, did that make you kind of? How did that make you feel about poetry itself? Was it that you'd been kind of you'd been mistaken, or was it just that you hadn't kind of gone far enough? Or
I think I felt that I was a sort of victim of the way that poetry had gone generally, because, like I say, there was this whole people were in a phase of kind of deliberately avoiding rhyme. Now, I'm a free verse poet. Okay, I've got nothing against formal verse. I really like it, but I'm a free verse poet, and I think free verse poetry can be just as musical as form. But there was a kind of a trend where people were writing just incredibly musicless poetry. And we were literally told, don't use words like soul, don't use words like transcendence. Well, you can argue that they're not good words in a poem, but there was something behind that which meant stay clear of stuff that isn't, that you can't see, that isn't empirical. So I felt that even in my own poetry, which looking back, I think it was good, but you can see that I'm kind of hitting my head against something, and I can't go beyond it.
yeah, so in a sense, what had happened was like a kind of a ceiling had been put on what poetry could even achieve.
Yes, yeah, I think so. And of course, there'll always be poets, that manage to break through that. Contemporary poets even today.
I suppose that's kind of reflective of a way that thoughts, especially in the 20th century, maybe post Second World War, started wondering whether can we know anything? Can we know God? Can we reach out? And everything had kind of been very horizontalized.
Yeah, it is horizontalized, and also people got very suspicious of beauty, because beauty was becoming cliched to some people. So people were chasing the ugly, and art was becoming very conceptual, which is more philosophical than artistic. The actual notion of making something and labouring to make something into a shape was becoming very old-fashioned.
Did Italy help you to kind of break through that a bit?
I think Italy now is in as big a pickle as anybody else
when
it comes to art and music.
So it's just slightly behind. So I say that as an Italian. All the bad ideas from here get there, but just maybe 10 years later.
Yeah. However, you can't deny, obviously, the beauty of the Renaissance. And I was always very affected by Renaissance painting. And my relationship with the Blessed Virgin came through Renaissance paintings. And there's actually a book of mine coming out next year, which is about my relationship with Mary. So that's kind of another story. I always was fascinated by paintings of her, and always had a painting of her in my room, really strangely. So she kind of predates my conversion, or she is the kind of the igniter of my conversion.
The prevenient grace.
Yeah.
No, so I mean, if we kind of move on to now, where I suppose the reason we're having this conversation is that you've just brought out a wonderful volume called 100 Great Catholic Poems. So I'd love to know kind of where the relationship with poetry as a Catholic art form kind of started, and where you started to conjoin those two interests.
Well, I mean, poetry, as I say in the book, is the language of Catholicism. There's no question. I mean, Scripture is made up so much of poetry. The Psalms are the most sublime religious poetry, and Isaiah and the Song of Solomon and all the rest of it. So, and even the New Testament, the way that Christ speaks in parables is a poetic, it's figurative language. So God chooses to communicate with us through figurative language. So poetry goes back to the absolute beginning of the faith. And when I was editing the book, one of the things I had to decide was, well, do I include scriptural poetry? And I decided no, because you've got the Bible. If you want to read poetry that's of Scripture, then go to the Bible. But I do begin with the Magnificat, because I thought, well, what better way to begin than with the Mother of the Word? And she's the first Catholic poet. So, but once we leave the Magnificat, then we go straight through, and the next one is Clement of Alexandria.
Well, just to go back to the Bible, so presumably, I think for most people, you would immediately think of the Psalms as kind of the book of the basic book of poetry within the Bible. So do you see that as where it kind of starts, or does it predate even that?
Well, I'm sure it predates even that, because I mean, if the Old Testament is absolutely full of it anyway, isn't it? So wisdom, and I'm not sure of the timeline. Forgive my ignorance, but if the wisdom and Ecclesiastes and all of those things, that's all poetry, isn't it? Yeah. Even Genesis. I mean, it's all poetry, the way that it's written to some degree. So yeah, it's always it really is, as I say, God's language of choice.
And in terms of, did you have a relationship with the Psalms before?
No, I don't think I did at all. I mean, I would have been I would have been familiar with some lines and some psalms, but I have to say, not. I was familiar with the Song of Solomon, and I did love reading that, but that was probably the extent of my knowledge of scripture.
Okay, so as you said, you begin then with the Magnificat, which is this incredible kind of hymn of praise. I'm interested in this relationship between kind of music and poetry, where and how, I mean, that in a sense belongs to the church's experience from forever. So how did you kind of see that, and where did you see the sort of intersection, and whether it's been lost a little bit?
Lost in what sense?
Well, I mean, in the sense that I think we've probably become a less musical, or our encounter, especially with prayer, has become less musical. There's less chant used now than kind of, I think once upon a time everything would have been chanted in a mass.
Yeah. I mean, yes, I lament the loss of aspects of music in the mass myself, very, very much. But when I was putting together the anthology, I had to consider, do I include hymns? And that's not a very straightforward question. The simple answer is no, I didn't include hymns. Just because the kind of hymns that people would think about would have turned the book into a hymn book, right? But at the same time, the word hymn means poem of praise. So you've got hymns by Gregory of Nazianzus and St Ephrem, etc. And some of those would have been set to music originally, but most poems were set to music way back when. So that's not surprising. But on the whole, I was careful to make sure they were simply poems rather than hymns that were specifically written for sung worship.
Okay, so I mean, you've mentioned a few things that you haven't included. So what was your kind of definitional statement, should we say, for things that you would include?
Well, it had to be poetry, and again, I broke my own rule.
Okay, so do you want to define that then? When you say it had to be poetry, what do you mean by poetry?
So as I just said, not a hymn written for sung worship, written, in. Define a poem. It's got to be written so that it has a particular form and there's a particular music to it, and it's not prose, and it's written in the genre of poetry. But I did include a prose poem, which is from Hamlet, and I did include St Augustine, which of course some people will say, oh, well, I shouldn't have done that. However, Late Have I Loved Thee is one of the greatest passages ever written in literature.
And I think whenever it's quoted as a poem, essentially.
People do chop it up, and I indeed have chopped it up, and I hold up my hands. But I just think that, we have rules to break them a little bit, and it's worth having him, because apparently I'm not a Latin scholar, but apparently that passage in Latin is phenomenally beautiful, and it really does transcend prose. So, and he was a poet originally. We don't have any of his poems left to us, so it's good to have him in there.
Yeah. So, okay, you used those kind of some of those early church poems, and I mean, I suppose so. We've defined poetry. It's 100 great Catholic poems. So I suppose the next thing we should say is, when you said Catholic, what did you mean there? Is it to do with the author, to do with the subject, to do with what?
Exactly. Well, I was given this wonderful work by Word on Fire, so they had their own remit. And they were very clear that they wanted it to be absolutely Catholic. So all of the poets here are Catholic poets. And initially I thought, that's difficult, because that means we can't have T.S. Eliot, we can't have John Donne, But actually, as I got into the work, I realized that there was an enormous wisdom in that, because what you end up with is an anthology that's unique, and that there's a very particular beauty running through the whole book, that that everybody is kind of pulling in the same direction. It's sort of, again, going back to Dante, it's like we're all on the same pilgrimage. And so all of the poets are Catholic, truly. Again, I've been not creative, but I've had to use my intuition. So Oscar Wilde is in there, and he converted on his deathbed. But the Ballad of Reading Gaol is just such an incredible document of conversion to me that I really thought it was worth having in there. And Edith Sitwell, her poem predates her conversion. But that's all well and good. I mean, ultimately, they came home to the church. Some poets I had to not use, like Toni Morrison. I would have loved to have put in some of her religious poetry. But she said, I'm not a Catholic. So if you had that vibe going on, then we said, okay, then don't be in it, because I'm sure that Toni Morrison wouldn't have wanted to be in it, and it would have changed the kind of the tone of the book.
And there was plenty to choose from, even
Yeah.
if you did just kind of reduce that to just the Catholics. I suppose the other word is, you talk about great Catholic poems. So when we talk about, even words like that are very unfashionable. The great works, great poems. What do you mean by great in this?
Yeah, well, some of them just are obvious. Obviously we have to have the Divine Comedy, we have to have Robert Southwell, we have to have Chaucer. There are certain things that just leap out at you. There's a canon there already. And then, it is difficult, isn't it? Like, is G.K. Chesterton a great poet? I think that Catholics would expect to see him in the book, and he's in the book, right? We've got two fantastic poems, and I think that he deserves a place. Other ones that I really struggled with, the two I struggled with the most were St Teresa of Lisieux and St John Paul II. And I decided to include them both for different reasons. So St Teresa of Lisieux, she's not a poet, and she wrote a great deal of verse that was very fashionable at the time. But she is such an incredible force of creativity in the Catholic imagination that I really felt it was worth having a poem of hers in there. And I chose To Scatter Flowers because it kind of talks about throwing the flowers around, as she did. And that's just such an important and key image in Catholicism. So I think she was definitely worth having in there. She had a very poetic mindset. And John Paul II, his poetry is incredible, actually. And the reason it's incredible is because he was a contemplative, and he had access to the way that people think and the way that they pray, and he had insights into the way that into the experience of the Blessed Mother, and all of those things made for a very weird and expressive poetic form. And I think he's really, really good. I mean, I think you can't say, looking at the general poetic canon, John Paul II was a great poet in that sense. But I think in a Catholic sense, he is great, and his poems are really, really worth reading and worth studying.
Yeah, I mean, we published his Roman Triptych, which is his kind of meditation on the Sistine Chapel. Probably one of the few works of poetry that we've published, but it's very beautiful and very it's interspersed with illustrations of those the pictures that he's describing there, and there is something very there's something quite kind of opaque about them, but with the images as well, I think it's much easier to understand what he's about. I was interested that you mentioned Chesterton. I think Chesterton's a great kind of popularizer. His poetry is very, very open, very understandable to everybody. And I mean, as somebody who's, I would say I'm not a great aficionado of poetry, I must say. But for those who aren't, for those of us who aren't, and for those of us who just find it sometimes just needlessly opaque, shall we say, what would you say? Why should we kind of persevere with it and go through that kind of initial difficulty?
Well, Thomas Merton, the great convert and monk and poet, he said that if you don't understand poetry, then you don't understand scripture. So the first thing I would say is that you really need to engage with it, because it is God's chosen language with us. So because the difficult things in life, the things that are most hard to understand, you can't understand them unless you have poetry, unless you have metaphor, unless you say that, something is like something else, because it's all about connecting the dots between things. When we have a very complicated or overwhelming emotion, we always resort to metaphor. If you're trying to describe somebody's face, if you think they're really beautiful, you might say, their skin is as pale as the moon, or whatever it might be. You're always pushed to metaphor, so it's really, really worth engaging with. And I think the other thing I say is that it isn't poetry that's difficult, it's life that's difficult, and poetry will help you to understand life better and help you to understand religion better and God better. But also I think people have the impression when they read a poem that they have to understand it and be able to like write an essay on it and say exactly what every word means and exactly what every image means. And you don't need to be able to do that. One of my favourite sets of poems is The Four Quartets by T.S. Eliot. And I read that incessantly in my 20s, and I had no idea what it was about. If you'd have said to me, it's religious poetry, I would have said, oh, is it? I really, really didn't know. But I just knew that the words were beautiful and they made sense at some level, and I just loved them. So you don't need to be able to understand it with your conscious mind. It's okay to kind of just let it sink into you, like music does.
Yeah, and that for a Catholic should be a pretty kind of usual thing to do in a sense. There's so many experiences that we can't immediately kind of grasp with our mind, and if we could, it would kind of belittle them in a sense.
Yeah, and I think poetry is a lot like prayer. There's when I write poetry, my mind feels very similar to the way that it does when I start to pray. There's something about emptying yourself out and letting go of distraction. And it's that kind of very, very quiet place that both prayer and poetry occupy. So, yeah.
So if I may quote something from your introduction, I'm sure you agree with, no other literary genre is so concerned with truth, not only in the sense of writing about true things, as the Irish bards did, or as the confessional poets do, as they dish us their personal lives, but in the scalpel precise rendering of things that humans cannot otherwise articulate. So what would you say is this kind of connection between poetry and truth? And I suppose, in a sense, going back to what you were saying at the beginning about what's happened to kind of contemporary poetry, why do you think that's been kind of severed a little bit?
Yeah, it's about, because poetry is about sort of scraping the varnish off life and really digging deep into what's there that isn't very easily accessible. And why have we lost that to some degree? It's difficult to say, isn't it? I think often with poetry there's lots of posturing going on, and that's not just for the 21st century. That happened in Victorian times, and at every phase you always get people writing what people want to read, which sounds I think it's good to write what people want to read, but if you're just kind of dishing them up things that are fashionable and things that are in the media, then you're not going to get to the truth, are you? So I think that's always a perennial problem in the arts.
You think you've just described kind of 99% of social media, it's just putting out stuff that people want to read, but is it going to last?
Yeah, well, we'll see. I just it's very difficult, isn't it, to know what's going to happen, because I think that art forms are changing profoundly with social media, but poetry has to last a long time.
So, if we may, I'd love if you could read us maybe a couple of poems from the collection, and maybe say something about them.
Yeah. So should we start off with an English one?
Yes, that'd be wonderful.
Yeah. So this is Robert Southwell.
Okay, a local boy from just across the river here.
Yeah, and he, of course, was hanged, drawn, and quartered. He went to Rome and became a priest, and came back to England to dispense the sacraments and to communicate the faith, and was living in hiding in the house of Anne Howard. And he was eventually found and caught and tortured. And this is a lovely poem, and we're coming up to Christmas, so it's a nice one to read now, because it's about him going out into the snow and having this kind of vision of the child Christ. And we see not just the child Christ, but also the passion, as this babe is sort of burning and is in pain in the flames. It's highly charged and full of metaphor. So, okay. The Burning Babe by St Robert Southwell. As I, in hoary winter's night, stood shivering in the snow, surprised I was with sudden heat, which made my heart to glow. And lifting up a fearful eye, to view what fire was near, a pretty babe all burning bright did in the air appear, who, scorched with excessive heat, such floods of tears did shed, as though his floods should quench his flames which with his tears were fed. Alas, quoth he, but newly born, in fiery heats I fry, yet none approach to warm their hearts or feel my fire, but I. My faultless breast the furnace is, the fuel, wounding thorns. Love is the fire, and sighs the smoke, the ashes, shame and scorns. The fuel justice layeth on, and mercy blows the coals. The metal in this furnace wrought are men's defiled souls, for which, as now on fire I am to work them to their good, so will I melt into a bath to wash them in my blood. With this, he vanished out of sight, and swiftly shrunk away, and straight I called unto mind that it was Christmas Day.
Beautiful.
Yeah, you can see the metaphysical stuff in that for students of literature. I mean, he was a precursor of the great metaphysical poets, and the metaphors are very convoluted. And sometimes you need to sit with a poem and go through it and read it more than once and, read it aloud and underline things, because it's very, very carefully wrought. I mean, the idea of him melting into a bath and washing the reader with his blood, it's really striking and strange and
Incredibly charged, considering what we know of what then went on to happen to him. I mean, I think one of the questions that kind of comes to mind is that in the way that we approach works of art nowadays, we tend very often to kind of separate them out from the artist who actually came up with them. Whereas I think, when you hear a poem like that, it's absolutely kind of completely tied to his own mission, to what he was, why he was even in England, the very kind of fraught nature of his the danger that he was constantly in. You can always kind of feel it there. What do you think about? I mean, in terms of these poems in particular, do you think that their the story of their author kind of really shines through, or is it maybe in religious poetry you can't help but have a kind of biographical element always there?
I mean, as you say, the trend is to say that the author is dead and to only look at the work on its own. But when I was asked to write a commentary for every single poem, I said to my daughter, who's 17, I said, well, if you're going to read a commentary for a poem, what do you want to hear? How shall I do this? And she said, well, we want to know the tea, which, as you probably know, is the gossip. She said, we want to know, like, why did they write it? What were they doing? Who were they? And I think she's right. I think that's what people do want to know, and that's okay. And I think, especially as you say with religious poetry, it's very important, where they were. It's very important to know that St John of the Cross was in a tiny cell being beaten up regularly when he wrote his incredible poems. That tells us a lot about the experience and about the poem. So I had no hesitation in giving that kind of background, as well as going into the poem itself, just kind of setting the scene and letting people know what kind of world the poet was living in and what they were up against, what they were personally going through.
So you would disagree with the postmodern mantra that there's nothing beyond the text?
It has its place. It does have its place, but of course, the author has no control over the text. So once the text is finished, how we interpret it cannot be wrong. The author can't say, "Oh no, I meant that," because frankly, once the author's done with it, it's a living, organic thing. However, when we're studying poetry, I think it's nice to know. And this could be used in academia, but this is a book for the general reader, so I think it's just good to give people interesting information.
What do you think of? Because I've always thought that, in particular, when we're talking about things which are inspired, and I suppose we probably need to just talk about that term, that in fact, God may be working through the poet to say something which the poet himself didn't even kind of realise. But is that a kind of something which we can say, or is that can you only say that from the point of view of a person of faith?
Most poets that I've come across, even if they're not religious, they can see that real poetry comes from somewhere else. You know, whether they think it's the unconscious or whether it's something external that's transcendent, you know, not everybody can agree on, but everybody does think that it comes from somewhere else. So yeah, I think if you write a really good poem, there's no question that it's not just from you. You haven't cooked it up. You know, there's something that happens that is very inexplicable.
Yeah, otherwise, it would just be like I've been very clever.
Yeah,
in
yeah.
putting
And
these words together.
That's right. And of course, there are poems that are like that. They're just very horizontal. You know, but some, and I think this is one of them. It's just so inspired. You know, it's absolutely of a piece. It's so complex but yet so clear-sighted. You know, I think it was a really inspired poem.
And for yourself as a poet, I mean, how's been your kind of relationship with that feeling of inspiration, and has it changed since your kind of conversion?
Yeah, well, I always had this sense that there was something else that would inspire me, a kind of a muse, and I would, you know, I was quite pagan. I used to do kind of little pagan rituals to kind of bring the muse on, you know. But now I'm very clear it's the Holy Spirit. So I always pray to the Holy Spirit before I write, and I don't write unless I think that I don't write poetry unless I think I really am called to do it. So I don't write much poetry, actually, because I think, to be honest with you, most people, you know, they would write very few good poems in their lifetime.
So do you want to read another good poem?
Well, this is talking about divine inspiration. This is Theresa of Avila. And Theresa of Avila, of course, was a 16th century nun who reformed the Carmelite order with St John of the Cross. And she's fascinating because she wrote some poems, but she wouldn't have described herself as a poet. And she said in her autobiography that sometimes when she had a very intense mystical experience, words would just flow through her and she would just produce a poem. So it really was divinely inspired. And this particular poem is written about, or it kind of reflects on, an experience that she had, which was also created by Bernini in the sculpture of her about to be pierced by the spear, with the angel with the seraph with the spear.
Ecstasy.
Yeah, the ecstasy of Theresa of Avila. So she felt this spear pierce her heart all the way through to her entrails, which she saw as an absolute conquering by God and an absolute being filled with grace, if you like. And she wrote this poem where God is described as like a hunter, and she's almost like a deer that's slain. And she even says that the arrow tip that he uses to slay her is smeared with poison. And that's what hunters used to do years ago, was to have poison on the arrow tip, so that when the deer was struck, it would fall down and it couldn't run away. So that's what God has done to her. And I'll tell you more about that once I've read the poem. Okay. And this is about those words, "My beloved is mine," by Theresa of Avila, translated by Dana Delibovi. I gave it all, relinquished all, and in this way I bartered. My love belongs to me, and I belong to him. When the sweet hunter shot me and left me wounded, when my soul lay panting in those tender arms, to balance out the cost of a new life, I took this trade. My love belongs to me, and I belong to him. He pierced me with an arrow, smeared with the poison of love, and my soul succumbed to be one with its creator. Now, I don't want another. To my God I have surrendered. My love belongs to me, and I belong to him. Now, the refrain there is obviously from the Song of Solomon, yeah. And the idea that this arrow has been smeared with God's love, what that means is that God's love goes into her bloodstream. It's like a transfusion. So this exchange between the two of them means that she can begin to love God in the same currency as he loves her. So it's quite clever. And some of the vocabulary in the poem is quite businesslike. I bartered, it's a trade, you know, but it's actually very passionate, and it's actually a great spiritual truth, I think.
I mean, I'm quite interested in one thing about this poem is presumably it was written in Spanish. And there are a fair number of poems, I think, in this collection which would have been originally written in another language.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think you've translated some of them yourself as well. So, you know, this the famous saying in Italian, the traduttore traditore. You know, the translator is also a traitor. So, you know, how does that kind of work, particularly in poetry? I've done a bit of translation myself, and it's a tough thing to do, even in prose sometimes. But in poetry, it's kind of next level. So how did you find it? And
I mean, first I should say as well that some poets simply couldn't be in the book because there wasn't a good enough translation, and I you know, I wasn't prepared to kind of put myself forward as a translator for all of them. Some of the older ones, like there are some in Middle English, and I translated a couple of those, and in a sense that I hope I did a good enough job. In a sense, they weren't too difficult to do. The only one that I really tackled from top to bottom was Vittoria Colonna, because I speak Italian, so I felt confident that I fully understood the poem. And of course, I had to be a traitor to the poem. I had to change some things, but it's pretty faithful. But of course, when you translate a poem, you can't be word for word faithful, because then you end up with something that's just not poetry. But it's certainly line for line faithful, and it certainly says what the poem says. So I think I was quite pleased with it.
And how important in those kinds of translations do you think it is also to get something of the rhythm and something of the...
It is important. I mean, sometimes you have to break the form. So there's one by Gregory of Nazianzus, which I'm very glad to get in, because he was a poet, and that was primarily what he was. He was a theologian poet, and he wrote in a particular form in Greek at that time, and I'd got some translations from the Greek by a scholar, and I asked her if I could use her translations to create a poem. And if I hadn't done that, it would have been not. And she, of course, she's a scholar. She said the same thing. Her work was not to make it into a poem, so I had to make it into a poem. So I broke with the form completely. But I think that that's worth doing, to bring his work to a more general readership. And the same with St Ephraim. I took a translation and I just kind of tidied it and broke the lines so it was more pleasing to an English-speaking ear.
And in a sense, we end up having a kind of a relationship with the new form sometimes, don't we? I mean, especially in those like the Magnificat or other texts which we become familiar with through repetition. The form, the new form in the new language becomes something that we end up having an affection for in and of itself.
I mean, look at Gerard Manley Hopkins with Adoro te devote, the Thomas Aquinas. We all know the English translation to that, and it's really, in a sense, quite different, but fantastic.
Yeah, and in a sense, it does that thing which the church often speaks about, and sometimes gets a bad rep, which is, actually grounding something in the local custom, in the local language, in order to make it more, not perhaps palatable, but more understandable to
enculturation.
Enculturation into a way of thinking, and because every language has and every people has its own kind of particular quirks and characters, and I think it's worth listening in a language that you can really kind of relate to. On that score, I suppose we need to say something about Dante. So the greatest poet of the Italian language, and I don't know. I often think his poetry is seen has an almost kind of scriptural kind of authority. I mean, I remember I called my eldest son Hector from the Iliad, and one of the reasons that I gave to myself that I didn't give my child a Christian name was that Dante had actually put Hector among the just pagans. So if Dante says it, then it must be true. So how's your? I mean, why is it so important to read Dante, even if you're not Italian?
Oh gosh, well, it's just incredible, isn't it? And it really is. I think any serious Catholic, it's all about the journey to heaven, and that's what this is all about. And on the way, you just see so many fascinating sights, and he really manages to dramatize sin and manages to dramatize goodness and all the kind of challenges and conflicts that we have along the way. And it's such an amazing world. And there's so much to it. I mean, you can never kind of know enough about Dante, the way that he did it, like even the kind of the cosmology and the numbers and all the background to it. It's just so fascinating. And I think, I mean, it's fashionable to say, oh, Inferno is the best one. It's the most entertaining one. I don't think so. I think that Paradiso is the best, because I don't think anybody has dramatized the beatific vision in such an incredible way. I mean, I think it's so beautiful. And all the stuff about Beatrice, who he was in love with, and Mary, and just, it really, to me, has the ring of truth. Of course, we can't ever know what the afterlife is like, but to me, Dante has that ring of truth.
The closest thing, yeah. No, and I mean, in a sense, I don't know, I feel like with Dante, and even maybe that kind of period, there was a kind of ambition in the production of art during the Renaissance, in which they were willing to attempt, a description of heaven. And as you were saying earlier, now we just about attempt a description of a toothbrush, and even then feel that maybe we're doing too much. So in one sense, you're kind of bringing us to a world in which was far more open to the transcendent.
Exactly. I mean, look at that. Like, Dante literally described the beatific vision. And, I think when we read it, talking about infused poetry, I wonder if he was a mystic. I wonder if he did have a mystical experience, because it's how could you make that up, But you're right. If you look at that, then you look at kind of what we're given now sometimes in terms of art, which is just so quotidian and just so lacking. There was such a gulf. And that's why this anthology is just such a gift, actually, because that's what it's about. It's poets with real ambition, like, serious ambition and beauty.
And speaking about the most important thing in the end, maybe even beyond romantic love is like, even beyond that.
Yeah, but we have romantic love as well.
Okay,
we do.
yeah,
it's in there too. But there's always
I mean, one question about Dante and about T.S. Eliot, about these poets who, I don't know, they there's all these kind of allegorical kind of fireworks going on in the background, and you come across these editions of books like The Wasteland, or poets like The Wasteland, or like Dante, in which half the 3/4 of the page is taken up by notes to the classical allusions and all the rest of it, and I think that can be a bit of a kind of mountain to climb sometimes. Do you think that's just a feature of a different time in which maybe kind of all knowledge was available to us? You didn't need to specialize in the way you do now, just because there's just so much to know, or is that again a thing of a question of ambition, or I mean, and how do you get beyond the difficulty of reading something where we don't get 99% of the allusions? I
mean, I personally wouldn't care about the allusions. I'm a terrible example. I mean, I happily read T.S. Eliot without knowing what it was all about. And I think footnotes can be very off-putting, and I wouldn't care. I wouldn't worry about it. If you want to read a book and not worry about the footnotes, then don't read the footnotes. I think that things should be okay to read on their own. But then if you want to know, then it can be wonderful to get into a world and really want to read more and more and more. And I mean, the lovely thing about Dante is that in the Dorothy L. Sayers translations, you've got, for Paradiso, you've got like a map that you can pull out with all of the heavens and the stars and everything. And it's an amazingly nerdy thing to get into if you want to do it. There's so much to know. But just to blow my own trumpet, I think that in this anthology, what's great is that I do a quick introduction, and then I write about each of the 6 cantos that we have, which are excerpted. It's only the last canto that's in its entirety. And if you read all the way through that, which wouldn't take you very long, you'd get a really good potted sort of story of the journey of Dante through the afterlife.
So you'd suggest not to worry too much about all the allusions and all that? I
would never worry. No,
okay.
I wouldn't. I mean, I think if you want to go into something, then do. But if you haven't got the time, then just read what you can read and just enjoy it, You need notes going through hell sometimes in poetry to know who's who. Yeah. I'll just say that, but that's not difficult to just check with notes.
So do you have one last one to read to us?
I'm sure I do. How can it be that I don't? What did we say? I could do a Gerard Manley Hopkins.
Oh yes, yeah, no, that would be wonderful, because Gerard Manley Hopkins, he's one of those one of those poets who at first kind of encounter is actually very, very difficult. His language is incredibly innovative, and but that can also be a bit of a kind of how can I say, kind of a wall between us and understanding it. So help us.
Yes.
Is that the
Yes.
wind? Because that one, I think that poem is included in the breviary, I think, as well.
Oh, really?
So I think I came across it a few weeks ago. Read it with my Italian wife, and she just looked at me kind of slightly blankly after.
I can do the Windhover. Yeah, so this is to Christ our Lord. So the Windhover, and so Windhover is a bird, and he's comparing Christ to a bird, and the language is so rich, and it's about the kind of amazing machinations and movements and twists and turns that this bird is making, and it's like Christ's incredible action in the world, and how towards the end there's a reference, it's very oblique, but there's a reference to the Passion, and how when the bird kind of buckles and goes down to fulfill what it is, that's like Christ's Passion, and how that it doesn't signify death, it signifies that the power of Christ continues on and on. So you'd need to read my commentary perhaps to get more from it, but I'll read the poem. The Windhover by Gerard Manley Hopkins, to Christ our Lord. I caught this morning morning's minion, kingdom of daylight's dauphin, dapple dawn drawn falcon, in his riding, of the rolling level underneath him, steady air and striding. High there, how he rung upon the rein of a wimpling wing in his ecstasy. Then off, forth on swing, as a skate's heel sweeps smooth on a bow bend, the hurl and gliding rebuffed the big wind. My heart in hiding, stirred for a bird, the achieve of, the mastery of the thing. Brute beauty and valour and act, oh, air, pride, plume, here, buckle. And the fire that breaks from thee then, a billion times told lovelier, more dangerous, oh, my chevalier. No wonder of it. Sheer plod makes plough down Sicilian shine, and blue bleak embers, ah, my dear, fall, gall themselves, and gash gold vermilion. So the gold vermilion at the very end is a reference to Christ's blood, I believe. This is my interpretation. So it's about how when the sheer plod of ploughing a field makes it sort of shine, you see, and the way that if we do what we're called to do, we will bring beauty into the world. And Christ's passion, of course, Christ's blood is still with us. It's still shining and saving us. So it's a very complicated poem, but how beautiful it is.
The way he uses the words, I mean, they are just, the words seem to be kind of little artifacts in themselves, and the way that they relate to each other is incredible.
I think he was the first modernist, actually. I mean, there's nobody like him for innovation apart from Shakespeare.
Well, that's a great place to go after that, because there's any number of books and podcasts and talks been given about the Catholicism or otherwise of Shakespeare, and you have included Shakespeare in this collection. Mm-hmm. So justify yourself.
Well, as I say in the introduction, I'm not a scholar. Okay, so if I read a book saying that Shakespeare is a Catholic, I'm inclined to believe it. And then if I read another book saying he's not a Catholic, I'm also inclined to believe it, you know. But I think there are very persuasive arguments historically that Shakespeare was Catholic and his family were Catholic, obviously. But really it was about the body of work itself. There's just so much that's very Catholic in the plays and in the sonnets that I thought that it was really worth including. Because I talk in the introduction about locating Catholicism in a poem and about the Catholic beating heart of a poem. And I mean, Hamlet is a very Catholic play. And the speech that I took, which is I have of late, it really is about the hierarchy of being and about man's glorious place and about divinization, about the fact that, you know, we are called to become godlike. And he does it so well. And he also does well the absolute disillusionment when that cannot happen, which I think is about the society that he was writing in, and the fact that the sacraments had been taken away, so divinization was not so easy to get, you know. So I also refer in the introduction to Ted Hughes's book, Shakespeare and the Goddess of Complete Being, which is a crazy genius type of book. And he talks about how Shakespeare is responding to the suppression of the feminine in religious sentiment in England at the time, and how the tragedies that Shakespeare writes, it's all about suppressing that feminine and then the man going mad. Now that's it's one of those brilliant and crazy arguments that Hughes had, and it received mixed critical acclaim. But it's a wonderful book, and I know what Hughes means. There is just something about Shakespeare where you can see that he's responding to a society being brutally suppressed in terms of their religious sentiment, and especially the feminine being suppressed.
Just the loss of Our Lady in particular. Yeah. Fascinating. I mean, so we, having spoken about the big guns, Hopkins and Shakespeare and Dante, of the kind of the lesser known of the poets in the book, who would you really kind of point us towards as little kind of undiscovered jewels?
Yeah, well, there's one of my favourite poems of all time by an anonymous 8th century author, Irish, called Donal Og, which means young Donald, and that's a beautiful, beautiful love poem. There's a 9th century poem about the crucifixion by a monk, which is just astonishingly gorgeous. There's a poet called Hadowich, who I'd never heard of, who was a Beguine in the 13th century, so there's a poem of hers. I mean, there are many, many undiscovered jewels that are incredible, actually. There's a poet from the 20th century called F.T. Prince, who was very famous in his hour and who has been forgotten. And he's a wonderful, wonderful poet. So I'm glad to bring these people out into the sunshine and to get there, to live in eternity in the poetic world.
Wonderful. So, of these kind of poems, have you had kind of a bit of reaction towards any that you were kind of surprised that struck a chord or?
Yeah, I mean, I did an interview a few weeks ago, and I read aloud the Robert Southwell that I read aloud a few minutes ago, and then I was selling books at St Patrick's a week later, and a young man came up to me and said, "I heard you reading that poem by that Jesuit priest," and he said I wanted to buy a book, and I thought, wow, it's amazing how things speak to people, even the young.
and across the centuries, that's the beautiful thing. I mean, you were just mentioning now 8th century poets now, and that we're still reading them and they're still resonating for us today. I suppose it speaks to the fact that in a sense nothing has changed inside of us.
Yeah, and I think people are glad to find ones that they know already, like the Shakespeare, because I put in a sonnet as well, 116, and Romeo and Juliet, the kissing sonnet. And people know Hopkins and Chesterton. Obviously, the Donkey is a big favourite. So they like to read the ones that they know already, because it's nice in an anthology to stumble upon things that are familiar as well. So yeah, the response has been very good thus far.
Is there any of your own work in here?
No. I mean, it was
it's like voting for yourself.
Yeah, it was suggested at one point, and I was absolutely not in a million years. These are great Catholic poets. In fact, there are no living poets in here.
Okay.
And that was something we decided upon quite late in the day. We just decided that people had to stand the test of time, and it would have been a bloodbath, let's face it.
Yeah. Well, in terms of kind of contemporary poets, who would you kind of recommend that people look at? And I mean, sort of the sort of traditional way of publishing poets in journals and magazines and things, as often happened in the past, that kind of has slightly faded, that way of publishing, or are there still poetry journals that one can get hold of?
Oh yeah, there are an enormous number of poetry journals, that there really are, and lots of very good poets. Father Paul Murray, who's a Dominican friar and teacher at the Angelicum University, I love his poetry. It's very simple and profound and luminous, and he has a book out with Word on Fire. James Matthew Wilson is a formal poet who's really wonderful, really, really inspired.
He's written a great book for CCS as well, on the Creed. Yeah.
I would also mention a British poet called Maria Apicella. Do you know her?
No.
She lives in Bury St Edmunds. She's a convert, and she won the Ford Prize for her collection Psalmody a few years ago. And she's an astonishingly gifted and innovative poet. Yeah. So, there are many others,
Well, thank you so much for your time, Sally. Thank you for opening up these poems to us. And I really recommend everybody to pick up a copy of the 100 Great Catholic Poems, collected together by Sally Reid and with your wonderful commentary. You can get that from wordonfire.org. And from all of us at the Catholic Truth Society, thank you for joining us in this episode of Into the Truth from wherever you are. We have a bunch of great episodes coming up, so do stay tuned and subscribe and like us especially on YouTube, where you can get notifications of the next few episodes. So thank you very much, Sally.
Thank you.